Aloha! Today we're going to play with our hips and how that feels in some standing poses. So we're going to start in Warrior Two, just to get a sense of how we feel right now. So take your legs wide, take a moment, big asana, and just get ready for the practice. Feet grounding, spine lengthening, reach your arms nice and wide. Let's take the hands behind your head. We'll get to Warrior Two, but let's just do a few things to prepare. Gently press the back of your head into your hands. Give yourself a little traction. And as you do that, bring your elbows towards each other. And then take your elbows away from each other. All right, and then release. Bring your hands to your hips. Keep your spine long. Right, left leg in or right leg out. Warrior Two. Notice how it feels. And then come up, and let's go to the other side. Right leg in, left leg out. Bending the knee, feeling the shape of the pose. Come back up. So now when you come into it again, what I'd like you to notice is what might feel a little bit challenging as you come into it. So where do you feel the challenge? Do you feel your back leg? Is it your arms, your shoulders? Is it hard to keep your spine long? Is it hard to get the opening in the hip joint to bring the leg closer towards the floor? Does your back leg resist that? Come up. Second side. I think there's some chickens outside. You may hear them clucking. They're kind of walking down the street. Reminds me of my favorite joke ever. Are you ready for it? I don't know if we're in Warrior, if you're ready for it. Let's come up for a moment. My favorite joke ever. Why did the chicken cross the road? Because it's a chicken. I think that's really funny. Okay, maybe that will help your Warrior. Right leg in, right leg out. So this time what I'd like you to feel as you come into it is to notice where your pelvis is in space. So notice how it is in relation to other parts of your body, but also the angle of it. So by that I mean take your hands to your hip points and notice when you come into it, are your hip points even? If you take your back of your hand onto your hip points, like you're a flashlight, what direction would it face? Right? I know sometimes I've been given instructions to keep the hips square, which if I did that would be a very different position than what I'm in now. So I'd just like you to notice that. And then notice the sides of the waist. Is one side shorter than the other? Okay, come up. Didn't give you much time to feel that. So come back down again. The position of the hip points relative to the front of the camera or the wall. The position of the hip points relative to each other, side to side. And then come up and let's go back. Let's go to the third side. This is the third time we're doing it. On the second side, again, feel where your hip points naturally go. Notice I'm not telling you there's a right way to go right now. I just want you to feel where it is. And notice if one is higher than the other. And you might even notice that when you go deeper, does that shift? When you bend the knee more, does that shift? All right, come back on up. Good. And then walk your feet together. So I want to play today with kind of three positions of the pelvis which affect the hip joint. Really three planes. And one is the position has to do with spinal flexion. And do you have your lumbar curve or is your lumbar curve flattened? So I'd like you to bring your hands to your hip points. This is a place to start. And take your pelvis a little forward and back. So it's hard to see when you look straight on a two-dimensional screen. But I'm encouraging my shoulders to stay stable. So we've done this before, right? It's a classic warm-up and dance move. So when you move your pelvis, the position of where the thigh bones are and the hip sockets changes. So that's one position. And if we're lying on the floor, right, if I take my sit bones really far forward, my back is going to flatten, and it would flatten on the floor. And if I go the other way, I have a pretty strong lumbar curve, and at some point my ribs will want to pop forward to accommodate. But for now, a few more times, keeping the rib cage steady, keeping the center of the body steady. So that's one plane. Now another plane is how the hip points are in relationship to the ground and the floor. So by that I mean, right now when you're standing on both feet, if you don't have a scoliosis, your hip points are probably at the same height if you don't have any leg length discrepancy or spine changes. With some of us, one hip point might be a little bit higher, but that's okay. What I want you to do is to feel what it's like to intentionally move one hip point higher and then the other higher. So if you're doing that, there's a bending of the knees that happens, but encourage that movement to come from straightening the leg that goes higher, of the hip that goes higher. And you'll notice when one hip goes higher, if you keep your shoulders steady, when one hip goes higher, the waist shortens. So that's the second plane. Another good exercise to practice, and of course it's the beginning of a shimmy. There's many different ways to shimmy. It's a whole nother conversation. You can shimmy from your knees, hips, ankles, etc. But getting this mobility here is a good thing. We just want to pay attention to when we're using it. Like if you're always hanging out like this, then you've got a habit of scrunching it up. All right, so third plane is forward and back. So that would be one hip point in front of the other. And again, if you're facing one side of the room versus the other side of the room. So play with that going back and forth. Again, encourage your shoulders to stay steady. So it's a twist. If it doesn't feel good to go fast or too strong, please don't do it. I know some of you have some sensitivities in the sacrum area. Just want you to feel that. This can actually be, if it feels good, it's actually a nice stomach strengthening exercise if you go a little faster. Ooh, and it can look pretty cool. And then you can also play with your feet a little closer together. Oh, I haven't done that for a while. I missed this movement. Okay, and then take a moment, mountain pose. Bring your hips back over your heels. Take your chin gently back, lengthen through the back of your head. Take your hands behind your head. Give a little pressure to your hands as you lengthen up. Hips over heels, lower ribs, hip points, pubic bone in line with each other. Good. And then release. Roll your shoulders a few times. Take your feet a little wider, and let's do a few hip circles. So now we're moving the hips in a lot of different directions, but we're more so moving the pelvis in relationship to the leg. And the leg is moving in the hip joint as the pelvis is as well. And then circle. So I know maybe it sounds like I'm using some words interchangeably. Generally, there's a colloquial usage of the term hip, which just kind of means this whole area. And then more anatomically speaking, they talk about the hip joint, which is where the head of the thigh bone goes into the pelvis, otherwise known as the head of the femur bone into the acetabulum. That's officially the hip joint, and sometimes I use them interchangeably. I'm acknowledging that. I will try to be specific as we do the things that we do today. But take your feet wide again, and now bring your hands onto your acetabulum, your pelvis, and encourage the pelvis to lift up a little and hinge forward. So in this position, I want you to do this just a few times. You're keeping your legs stable and you're moving your hip sockets up and over the thigh bones. The legs are staying stable, and because of the position of the pelvis moving, you're creating this change of shape. Then the other, not exactly extreme, but other end, I guess, of the spectrum is keeping the pelvis stable and moving your thigh. So that would be bending your right knee. Keep your hands on your hip points so your pelvis is not moving, and rock the leg in and out. That's one example of you're just moving the thigh in the pelvis. So you're moving the hip joint by moving the head of the femur bone in the acetabulum, and then switch sides. Okay, and then release. All right, and then do whatever movements you want. A little shake, shimmy, any movements you want. And make your way down to the floor. And as you go down, pay attention to how you get there. Once you're on the floor, lie down in your back with your knees bent. And I want to play a little bit here with the same movements we were doing standing. So first movement is rocking the pelvis. So rock it back and forth. So you can feel when the sit bones lift, your lower back presses down to the floor. When the sit bones go the opposite direction, which I guess is the back of the sit bones pressing more towards the floor, the back arches. So when this happens, you're not only, I guess, arching the back, is actually creating movement in the spine, so that when your back flattens, you're creating flexion in the spine. When the back arches, that's extension. Most of us tend to experience a lot more flexion in our life than extension. So we want to notice when we come into poses, do we do that movement in the pelvis, sometimes without realizing it? So that's one of the planes. Another one is the hips. In this position, it's either moving in the direction of your shoulders or your feet, and specifically the hip points. So I mentioned the acetabulum, which is the pelvis itself, and the two bony protuberances at the front of it are called the hip points, otherwise known as anterior superior iliac spine, otherwise known as ASIS, but mostly hip points. Whatever terms you want to learn, go for it. It helps if you're studying anatomy stuff. So with that, now you've got a sense where your hip points are, because I've talked about them for a while. I'd like you to shift your pelvis so your right hip point comes more in the direction of your shoulder, which means your left hip point is going to go the opposite direction. And then switch. Bring the left hip point closer to the left shoulder. And as you go back and forth, place your hands on your waist, and you might feel how the movement of the pelvis here shortens one side of the waist. So that's another movement we make. We often make these movements without realizing we're doing it. That's why today we get to pay a little more attention to that. Now, the other plane was that twisting motion, which lying down, it's hard to do when you're completely flat on the floor because you don't have a backwards to go. So lift your pelvis a little off the floor, and then press your right foot down a little, lift your right hip point up towards the ceiling, and then switch, lift your left point up towards the ceiling. And go back and forth a few times. You may notice that to do this generally requires some hip strength. And by that, in this regard, I'm talking about you need to use your glutes. Sometimes you may notice you use your quads more than your glutes, or the glutes more than the quads. It varies depending upon your body. You might find one side of the body uses a glute, one side uses a quad. All right, and then release. So you've got those three directions: the forward back, the up and down, and the side to side. Now that comes into play in a lot of different postures that we do, and it often comes into play unknowingly. So what I would like you to do now is to explore. That's what we're going to do, explore how that happens. For example, bring the right knee in towards your chest and pay attention to your lower back. right? You can probably draw your right knee in very deep, but then when you do that, your lower back presses into the floor. And when you do that, you may find that your right hip point goes higher and the right side of your waist shortens. You might also notice that because of some of those shifts, you press with the left foot or something and one hip point comes closer to the ceiling. Do the same thing with the left and just notice as you bring the knee closer and closer what your shifts tend to be. Does the back press into the floor? Does the left hip point go to the shoulder? Does one of the hip points go closer to the ceiling? So then what I'd like you to do is take all those pelvic movements out of it so you're only moving your leg. And it helps to use the belly here. So on your exhalation, encourage your hip points to move towards each other. And then draw your navel down towards the floor. So you might find your breath coming into the ribs a little. And then bring the right knee towards your chest. So it's kind of like the grazing the grass movement, strengthener. There's a moment where you might find that you press your left foot more strongly on the floor. That's okay. But what I want you to do is keep the stability in the pelvis until you get to a point where you feel like, oh, that's about as far as it's going to go without my pelvis shifting. Just see where that is. So one of the things we do with all these, the more fine-tuned practices, is we find that edge, right? And then we work towards increasing the mobility right on that edge. But if we push ourselves to try to get into a shape of a pose, we often skip that edge and just have one of these movements of the pelvis without necessarily realizing it. Second side. Draw your hip points towards each other, encourage your belly to engage, and lift the left foot. Of course, breathe, but can you keep stability in the whole pelvis? All right, and then release. All right, so to help with the belly, do a little more stability, let's come onto all fours. I'm just going to shift gears for a moment. Get your two blocks and take the blocks under your knee. So come onto your hands and knees. And let's just play with keeping the pelvis stable again. And as the pelvis stays stable, you can choose a little more challenging, having your feet off the floor than having your feet on the floor. Go ahead and lift your right hand and don't move anything else. So that in order to do that, you need to stabilize from the belly. Just waking up the belly a little more. And then bring your right hand on the ground. And let's do the same thing with the left. No movement in the pelvis as you take your left hand off the ground. All right. And then puppy pose. Stay on the blocks. Get the length in your spine. Breathe. And then walk your hands back under your shoulders. And now let's do a little bit with the legs. So take the left block away and balance just on your right knee, keeping the pelvis stable. Notice the tendency to want to try to drop, doing that twisting motion. Can you keep the pelvis stable here? Whee! I like this one. All right, and then do the other side. You could walk over to the other block. So the right knee's hanging in space, pelvis is stable, neutral. You have a little lumbar curve, your hip points are even with each other. They're above the parallel thighs. Woo. And then release. I really like this as a kind of a gentle way to get good abdominal strengthening. So let's do a few cat and cow tilts now. Get the move of your pelvis. You can be on the blocks still. So a few in this moment is going to mean 3. And now let's come back to the left leg, hovering, and maybe lift the right arm. So we're requiring a little bit more stability from the center here. Pelvis might feel wants to move. Can you keep it stable? Can you keep it stable and talk at the same time? And breathe. Good. And then release. And then go back. Go to the other side. Keeping the pelvis stable. Balancing. And then release. And come into downward facing dog. Just take a moment, open up the backs of the legs. Bend your knees, lift and widen your sit bones. And then in downward facing dog, take your pelvis in those different directions. So a little bit cat and cow tilt like. And then a little bit hip points towards the shoulders, which means you're going to have to bend your knees. And then a little more a twist. You may find that when you move the pelvis, or when you try to move the hip points in one direction, they might move in more than one. So when you do that twisting type motion, you might find that the hip points also go, one goes closer to shoulder than the other. That's okay. Good things to notice. All right, press the base of your palms towards the front of your mat. Move towards straightening your legs. Breathe. All right, and then come into child's pose. And then inhale up to sitting and lie down on your back. And have a strap within reach. So now we're going to come back to using our awareness of the pelvis to keep it stable and a little bit more belly engagement to help keep it stable. So as you exhale, notice that your belly is there. Encourage it to engage a little. Drawing the hip points towards each other. And you might feel some of the pelvic floor muscles also engage when you do that. And then, without putting pressure on your left foot, bring your right knee towards the chest. Go slow until you get to that point where you're about to round the lower back. For me, it's about here. So it's not that deep, actually. And then, bring your hands onto your hip points. And I'd like you to externally rotate your thigh. Only to the point where your pelvis is staying stable. So you can see we're going towards a figure 4 stretch, but if I'm keeping everything stable, this is about as far as I go actually. And then come back to neutral and do that a few times. So externally rotating the thigh, come back to center. And then release. Take a nice inhalation. Exhale, second side. Don't put too much weight on the right leg as you bring the left knee towards your chest. Find the stability in the pelvis. And then take the leg externally and back to neutral. And then bring your left foot onto the floor and release. Okay, so now let's come back to the right side Bring the right knee towards the chest. Externally rotate your leg. And then, keeping everything stable, for a moment, notice that if you are going to come into the figure four, which is taking your right ankle over the left thigh, what part of your pelvis are you going to move? Just notice what part it is, because we all got something. For me, what I notice is I tend to actually lean to the side that I'm externally rotating, and that makes the left hip point go higher than the right hip point. And then I get my foot there, and then sometimes I can bring it back to neutral. So I'm okay with that, because there are benefits of this posture, even if the pelvis is not symmetrical. So hold that there, and then again, hold on to your hip points, externally rotate the thigh. Take a nice inhalation. Maybe begin to bring the left knee towards the chest. Can you do that keeping your hip points even? Now, do you tend to lean to one side or the other? Again, I find myself tending to lean to the right. So can you keep even here and still find the stretch? So the intention here is not to always do this with perfect symmetry. It's to find out what are the places we move habitually, and then maybe begin to explore, change them. And also sometimes stepping back, we can create more mobility in areas and more strength in areas that we've been skipping. So that if you always tend to lean to one side when you do this pose, there's parts of the stretch that you're missing. So coming back to that more symmetrical position, you might be able to find some places, some new places. At least that's what I've been doing. Okay, and then release, left foot on the floor, right foot on the floor. Hands at the hip points. Now, if you are extra curvy, of course, your pelvis is not going to be symmetrical. So that's something just to be aware of, that when you start, there's going to be an asymmetry. And you could do this with the wedge underneath if you'd like to, on the concavities. But you can still, even with the asymmetries, notice when and what your habitual ways of moving are. Second side. Take the left leg. Keeping the pelvis stable, externally rotate from the thigh. And then notice what you might need to do to get the ankle over the thigh. And then maybe you can undo it once it's there, maybe not. And then bring your right knee toward your chest. Breathe. Good, and then release. So this time we're going to do a figure four one more time. This time what I invite you to do is allow for one of those three planes to not stay neutral. And I'm going to, for me, I'm going to let it be the pelvis rocking back and forth. And actually I recommend that for everyone. Let's try it that way, everyone, together. So externally rotate the right thigh. Take the right ankle over your thigh. Now, encourage your hip points to stay even with each other in regard to the floor ceiling direction and head sit bone direction. As you bring your knees into your chest, your left knee chest, but maybe let your spine round a little so that you'll be bringing the knee closer towards the chest. You'll be getting the stretch probably in the other parts of the piriformis. And then take a look. You can lift your head up. Notice, did you still tend to hike one hip higher than the other? This is nice. And getting a little places I tend not to get. And then release, left foot on the floor, right foot on the floor, second side. Take your time to bring the left ankle over the thigh, keeping the hip points, again, stable. Bring the right knee towards your chest. Don't force the back to flex, but let it happen. Notice if you tend to lean towards one side. I still tend to lean towards the side of my knee that's my ankle, my leg that's rotated. And when I don't, when I shift that, I get some sensation in places I don't usually experience. And then release. All right, after that, focus, the little Tetrasana, move around, different directions, exploring, playful, playing. And then go ahead, find your strap. And let's take the right leg up. Bend, lean towards your chest, foot around the strap, take the foot into the strap, strap into the foot, and find Supta Padangusthasana. Now the same thing applies here. In some ways it's a little easier than the figure 4. But if you take your leg too far into your chest, you're really just flexing the spine. And that's the one thing I really encourage avoiding in this pose, because it kind of defeats the purpose. You can flex your spine in other places. But here, get a nice length in the back of the leg. And then check out your hip points. Are they on the same plane? Now there might be a little shift with regard to the plane of the floor ceiling plane, because your sacrum, your back, your hip joint is in a little bit different position. So you might feel that difference there. It's pretty subtle though. Okay, now go ahead and take both ends of the strap into your right hand, externally rotate your leg. Now don't shift the pelvis at all. You can bend your elbow to keep your forearm, upper arm on the floor to support your leg. And take your right leg out to the side and see how far it goes without you creating any shift in the pelvis. You may notice it doesn't go very far. So left knee is bent. You can take the left knee out to the side if that helps support you. Actually, it's going to make it easier to take the right leg out to the side if you let the left knee go out to the side. But there's some point where the pelvis is going to shift, right? The left hip point's going to come up towards the ceiling. The right hip point might come up towards your shoulder. Just go to where that edge is. And then come up and release. And do the same thing on the second side. Left leg up. I'm going to turn a little so I get the wall in my way. Hip points even. Externally rotate the leg. Take it out to the left, and at first keep your right knee stable. You may find that you can't go very far if you don't take your right knee out to the side. So hold it there for a moment. Notice shifts. And then notice if you take your right knee out to the right as you take the left leg out to the left, if it's a little easier to maintain the stability there. And then bring both legs on up and release. Okay, we're going to come back to the first side, but this time extend your left leg. Bring your right knee into your chest. Come to Supta Padangusthasana 1, strap around the foot, and encourage your hip points again to be in line with each other. No flexion in the back. And externally rotate the leg, and check how far your leg goes now with the leg straight. Now I find I can't get very far at all without moving my pelvis. So what does that tell us about standing poses? I think it tells me that many standing poses, the pelvis cannot remain symmetrical. And that's how it was taught for a long time to people that often, from what I understand, wound up with sacroiliac issues. So the pelvis does need to move. Right? So if you take your right leg out to the right more, you may notice that the left hip point comes higher, closer towards the ceiling than the right. And that's an action I think is good in this pose. Now another thing to notice, bring the leg back up. Does the right hip point come higher towards the shoulder as the leg goes off to the side? What if it does? What if it doesn't? How is that different in how you move your leg? Breathe. So there is a difference between, what am I saying? Oh, so what I'm saying is that you might begin to feel different places that you stretch depending upon how you hold your pelvis. Okay, and then bring your right leg up. Let's release that. And same thing with the left leg. Take the right leg extends, externally rotate the left leg, and just notice how far it goes without any movement in the pelvis. So if you stuck to symmetrical pelvis, you would not have a lot of range of motion. You won't be able to do a lot of things. So go ahead and take the leg out and let the pelvis shift a little and just notice how it shifts. And then bring the leg back up. And release. We're going to come back to the first side one more time. So go over to your right side. I'm going to do my left side if you're paying attention, just because the wall didn't let me, I didn't do the first side. But now what I'd like you to do is externally rotate the leg and allow for range of motion in two planes. Allow your left hip point to come a little higher. Allow up towards the ceiling. Allow your right hip point, maybe a touch, to come a little closer towards your shoulder, but do not create flexion in your back. So keep your lumbar curve as you go. Notice how that feels. Breathe with that. Keep a long reach through the heel. And then bring your right leg on up and switch sides. So go on over to the left side. Foot around the strap, externally rotate the leg. Take the left leg off to the side. Now I didn't talk about the position of the leg you're not taking to the side. I guess I could have mentioned it earlier, sorry I didn't, but there's different also ways you can do that, and one is having the leg straight in line with the pelvis, another is having it a little off to the side. They have different effects. Breathe. And then bring your left leg back up. And release. And again, Tetrasana. Whatever you want to move. You can do a lot with our hips. Maybe move the elbows, the wrists, the shoulders, the fingers, the jaw. Let's come up to sitting. And take your right leg to the outside of your left thigh. If it doesn't go there, bring it in front of the shin. If a little height helps, go ahead and take a little height. Bring your hands to your knees. Lengthen your spine. So another way to get the piriformis stretch is this twist. Notice here, check with your hip points. Is one higher than the other? We have a tendency to lean on one sit bone more than the other in general, but even more so when we twist. So let's keep the sit bones grounded. Nice inhalation. On your exhalation, spiral to the right. Use the muscles of the center of your body to spiral. Inhale, lift and lengthen. Exhale, spiraling, keeping the length on the exhalation. One more inhalation. On the exhalation, unwind. Since we're here, let's take a hold of the pinky toe side of the right foot. Take your thumb to the hip point. Wrap your hand around the upper outer thigh. Keep that rotation as you move towards straightening. Ooh, the right leg might not straighten all the way. You might want a strap too to hold up the foot. Breathe. All right, and then release and switch sides. So left leg to the outside of the right thigh, knee towards the chest. Nice inhalation, exhale, spiral. Take your time to feel all the different parts. And exhale, unwind. Take a hold of the pinky toe side of the left foot. Thumb, top of the left thigh. Give it a little wrapping around as you move towards straightening the leg. Feeling, yes, feeling here? I'm definitely feeling there. It's not a bad thing to feel here. We need this tissue to hold us together. It's just a matter of when it gets a little too tight. All right, and then release, and downward facing dog. Lift your heels as high as it will go. Take your sit bones up and wide. It's going to change your relationship with your thigh bones. Keep that lift of the sit bones as you lower the heels towards the floor. They may get there, they may not. You may notice your dog's a little too short, which often happens when there's a desire to get the heels down. Okay, and then bring your feet forward between your hands. If forward fold doesn't work for you, come into child's pose. Bend your knees. Lift and widen your sit bones. And then move towards straightening your legs. And bring your hands to your sacrum. Let's inhale, come up to standing. Sweep the arms on up. Interlace the fingers, nice long reach and stretch. Reach your arms out to the side. And roll your shoulders a few times up and around. I've been saying so much attention to the hips. Let's just do a little bit for the arms. So circle. Shoulder blades, and then take your arms wide. Reach the shoulder blades wide. Go ahead, look out over the right hand. Can you connect? Have a nice long line from your shoulder all the way through your fingertips. I have a little drop off on my wrist, so I always see my hand go down, so I try to get that smoothed out. I guess I hear in Tai Chi that's really important. Go ahead, turn it over to the left. Come back to center. Check, did your hips go past your heels? Bring your hips over your heels and take your right elbow over your left elbow. Let's cross the elbows. Give yourself a hug. So shoulder blades come wide. Take your chin back. And then option to stay here or straighten the arms and come to Garudasana, the cross of the, bringing the palms together as the forearms roll over each other. And then release, fly a few times. Reach your arms wide and take the left elbow over the right. Hands towards the shoulders. Give yourself a nice hug here. And either stay here or extend the arms again and wrap the forearms around each other. And then release to fly. All right, so let's go back to those hip movements. One of them was pelvis going forward and back. As you do this, take your hand, one hand on the belly, one hand on the lower back, and feel how the movement of the pelvis affects both of them. Okay? Good movement to do, fun with dance, especially learning to do it while keeping the shoulders steady. It's a forward and back shimmy, which we're not going to do any more of right now, but another time. All right, then the up and down. So one hip point, other hip point. Again, can you do that? Keeping the shoulders stable. So as my dance teacher would say, if you couldn't see the bottom part of the body, it would look like you were standing still. That's Rebecca Vasily. She's an amazing dancer if you ever want to watch her. She lives in Santa Rosa right now, or Petaluma. No, she's in Petaluma, I think. Okay, then third one, hip points forward, so it's a twist. So many of us have a little of this twist in our body, but it's habitual, we don't even know it. But when we try to do it, it's not so easy. In some ways, it's a little easier if you do it a little faster. And again, trying to keep the shoulders steady. This is a good abdominal strengthener, too. All right, then release. Mountain pose. And big asana. Arms wide, legs wide. Bring your hands to your hips. I'd like you to feel a sense of the hip sockets lift up and over your thigh bones as you hinge forward. And then come back on up. And do that again. So stability in the center. And then bring your feet back towards each other. So that one, we are moving the hip sockets over the thigh bones. Now, again, moving the thigh bone in the hip socket. Bend your right knee. And so sink for a moment. See what it's like to sink, right? When you sink, this side of the waist shortens. So let's not sink. And just by doing that, you're already kicking in the glute med a little bit more. Right? Hands on the hip points, rock back and forth. And then release. And second side. Hands on the hip point, rock back and forth. And back to center, so that when we come to tree pose, my understanding of tree pose is we want to keep a kind of centralized, stable pelvis. Especially poses what we're holding for a long time. Like if we're moving around, move your leg around, that's fine. Actually, let's do that a little bit. Take one leg up, move it around, move your pelvis around, and go to the other side. Let all those different pelvic movements come in. It's kind of fun to do. If you balance is hard, use a wall. But if we're going to hold for a long period of time, we don't want to be in some sort of torque position. And that's one of the reasons why having the bone alignment for yoga is so important. Plus, it helps connect all the different parts and gets the prana to flow. So we're going to bend the right knee, spiral the thigh, take your foot below or above the knee. Now when you do this, your leg is going to be at an angle. It's not going to be directly sideways. I think I've demonstrated this a few times live, but I don't know if it's in here. See, this would be, if my leg was going to go out to the side, see how different the position is. So in order to make it go to the side, I have to put a big torque on my pelvis. So I would have to go pshoo, and then there'd be a big torque here. Well, that's not what I want for this pose. We want to find the stability where the muscles become aligned when you're holding, when you're stabilizing something. That's one of the reasons why symmetry is so important in yoga, because we're holding these positions for longer periods of time. All right, stay here or take your arms on up. And if you can do the magic trick of making your arms disappear like I just did, or your hands. And then release. Come back on down, even yourself out on the legs. And then second side, bend the left knee, spiral the thigh. Hands at the hips, take your foot below or above the knee. Breathe. Option to stay here or take your arms on up. And then release. Take a moment, mountain pose. And now come back into warrior two. This is where I think it's really interesting. So, legs wide. Left leg in or right leg out. So already by doing that position, we change the position of our hip points, right? So come back with your feet parallel. Hip points, if you imagine flashlights on your hip points. That's what my teacher Mary Pafford used to talk about. Probably maybe still does. I miss her. Fingers facing forward. Turn your left leg in, right leg out, and notice just by doing that how there's a shift. Right? If you didn't do that shift, there'd be a lot of torque on the body. So all those times where in the past, a lot of people in the Iyengar system really got focused on this sense of symmetry, and it kind of wreaked havoc on the sacrum. So we want to allow that pelvis to shift. So you may look and notice that one hip point is a little forward and one hip point a little bit back. Now, are they at the same height though? That's the thing. So then go ahead and bend your front knee. Do the hip points stay at the same height? Do you have length on both sides of the waist? Come back up and do that a few times. So in my experience, I'll say it feels to me that a little bit like the back hip point is a little bit higher than the front, but not very much. Especially if when you come in and out of the pose, you keep your spine over center, right? A lot of people tend to do something like this, sometimes like that, and then things get a little skewed. But if you keep your spine right over center, the hip points will stay pretty much on the same level here, but they're going to shift in this forward back direction. Now the other place that they would, remember that's two of the places we talked about. The third one was a tilt and tuck. Now what tends to happen in this pose is when there's tightness in the thigh, how the thigh moves in the hip socket, that's when the tilt or tuck comes in. So in Virabhadrasana 2, in Warrior 2, I think the best place is to keep that plane neutral. So you keep the same lumbar curve you would have when you're standing. So I'm just going up and down a few times, so I hope you're doing that too, so you can feel those shifts and where you can be stable. In the Iyengar system, what they call the final version of the pose is having the front thigh parallel to the ground with the pelvis over the center. And to do that requires a lot of mobility in that external rotation. Let's go over to the other side. And just for the past few days, I've been doing the practice like we did with the figure 4. And I'm already noticing a change in how accessible this pose is on the deeper level. So coming up and down again, feel what happens, because it might not be the same on the other side. One thing I also to take note of is often the instruction that's given to have your knee over your ankle. And if you have the hip rotation, mobility, the knee tends to automatically go there. You don't have to think about it. The knee tends to excuse me, turn in when you don't have the hip mobility. So up and down. Playing with what shifts. Can you keep center? So can this begin to become kind of a warm-up pose over time? It's a simple pose and it's a challenging pose. Okay, and then let's come back to the first side. Left leg in, right leg out. Take the arms on up. Nice inhalation, shoulder blades firm. Reach out through the fingers. And on your exhalation, Virabhadrasana 2. Do you tend to go forward, back? Can you take a quick look or feel? Scan. Look out over the right arm. There is a little twist in the pose. Right through the spine, and of course in the neck. And then come back up, and one more side, one more time, one more side. Come back up, and time for wide-legged forward fold. If you want to grab your blocks, go ahead. Otherwise, just fold on forward. Hip sockets lift up and over your thigh bones, but make sure you don't slip too much. Let your spine release towards the floor. All right, and then come on up, bend your knees slightly, bring your hands to your hips, walk your feet towards each other. Take a moment, mountain pose. And then move your way down. Get your flow on. Can you move your pelvis in all sorts of different directions? Maybe combine those 3 different places. Maybe you have some sound effects. Okay, and then make your way down to the ground. Lie on your back. And since we've been nice and symmetrical, go ahead and get 2 blocks. And we're going to place one between your knees and one between your feet. So that when we come into a twist, we really get the full effect of a twist, not a roll. So once you've got the blocks between your feet and your knees, lift your hips a little. Bring your knees towards your chest. And then very slowly take your knees over to the right. So the intention of keeping the left hip point over the right hip point when you come into the full twist. You might find that your left shoulder comes off the floor. That's okay. Sometimes we keep the shoulder on the floor and let the knees not go all the way down. Today, let the knees go all the way down. But to maybe go a little more into the twist, press your right elbow down into the ground. Lift the right side of your rib cage up so you spiral a little more to the left. And then lower it on down. That will give you more of a twist throughout your whole body. And then bring your knees on up. Lift your hips, shift them to the right. And take your knees, again, in towards your chest a little. And then take your knees over to the left. Upper body spirals to the right. If you find your shoulder came off the floor, even if it didn't, press your left elbow, forearm, upper arm onto the floor. Lift the left side of your rib cage. Spiral a little more to the right. And gently guide your breath. And then inhale your knees back up. It's time for Shavasana. Put the blocks off to the side. Get whatever you want so you feel comfortable, supported, and happy in Shavasana. Extend your legs, arms by your side. Let your breath flow. And let the flow of the breath guide you to Shavasana, to relaxation. And then slowly and gently bring your awareness back to your body, back to your breath. Bring a little movement to your fingers, bring a little movement to your toes. Reach a little through your arms, reach a little through your legs. Bend your knees. Roll over to your side. And make your way up to seated. Find your sit bones grounding down, spine lengthening up. Let's bring our palms together over our hearts. And may our practice support a greater sense of comfort, ease, joy, and freedom. Namaste. So thanks for joining me. I think I said during the practice that paying attention to those little shifts has been really great for me in feeling more comfortable in these standing poses. And I encourage you to practice it. Of course, we don't always want to spend so much time going slowly because we want to move and groove too, but taking the time can have good, long-lasting results. So may you enjoy your hips. And until next time, aloha, mahalo.